Thank you, Perrin, and good morning, everyone. It's great to be here with you all today. My name is Tina Ackermans. I'm the Vice President of Strategy and Corporate Development at Suncor. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce is a great cross-sector organization with reach far beyond the energy industry. And this particular event today aligns so well with our own inclusion and diversity values that we at Suncor are very proud to support it. Having spent over 25 years in the traditionally male-dominated oil and gas sector, I'm encouraged by how much more inclusive the workplace is today versus when I started my career over 25 years ago. I'm pleased to see increased representation and success of women in our workforce, in our leadership ranks, and on our board of directors. And yet, at the same time, I have a healthy dose of impatience because we still have a long way to go. And frankly, progress still isn't happening at the speed that it should. As Perrin so eloquently described, the statistics are clear. Diverse work environments are high performing work environments. They consistently deliver stronger business results. And that is a compelling business case for continued change and progress. And that starts with increasing awareness and fostering the right discussions. I'm convinced that this morning's fireside chat will deliver on those objectives. And so, without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome Stephen Tapp, Chief Economist at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, to take the mic to kick off this morning's fireside chat with special guest Deanna van Maasdijk. Stephen, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Tina. So today we're very fortunate to be joined by Deanna van Maasdijk. She's a real trailblazer in gender equity in business. Deanna is the co-founder and CEO of Equileap, and Equileap is a leading provider of data and insights on gender equality in the corporate sector. Equileap researches and ranks thousands of public companies around the world, and they have a comprehensive gender equality scorecard. Before joining Equileap, Deanna worked as the head of philanthropy at ABM AMRO Private Bank, and she was also previously a director of development at Mama Cash, which is the world's oldest international women's fund. Deanna, we're grateful to have you with us today. Thanks a lot. Welcome.
Thank you for the invitation. Thrilled to be here.
And so our plan for the fireside chat today, Deanna's going to start and go over a few slides to provide an overview of her work, and then we'll get into some questions. So Deanna, over to you.
Okay. Yeah, great. So indeed, I wanted to give you a little bit of an overview of what is Equileap and what we do and why we do this. We are a data providing company. We fall under the ESG data, and we strengthen the S, the social, of ESG. We are also a social enterprise, meaning that we have a clear goal. When I set up Equileap, I did so because I wanted to close the equality gap in the workplace, and I wanted to do that quicker. And I thought a strategy that we hadn't tried yet for closing the equality gap was using the power of data and the power of investment. So pretty much what we do is that we collect data and we then sell it to investors. And in the past few years, we've been able to become the most comprehensive database of gender equality for the corporate sector. What we have in our database is 5,400 publicly listed companies. It's important to note that these are all public companies. It includes companies in Canada and in 23 developed economies. Plus, we are researching this year 25 emerging markets economies too. We have 8 years of historical data. And this is what allows us to go to investors and make the data available. This is the most important slide that I wanted to share with you, and it's our gender equality scorecard. As you can see, it's divided into 4 sections, category A, B, C, and D, which are highlighted in yellow. And in white, you see the bullet points, which are the specific indicators that we track. It's important to know that this scorecard tilts towards transparency. What we do is that we take the scorecard and we research each one of the 400 companies in our database. by going to the annual reports, corporate social responsibility reports, websites, press releases, anything a company has published themselves. And we look for the data that we have here in the bullet points. So for example, under category A, we look at the gender balance, meaning what's the percentage of men and women at the board of directors, at the senior management, at the C-suite, at the management, at the workforce. And we give points for balance. The highest points go to whenever there is anything between 40 and 60% men and women. The lower the balance, the less points. I have to also note that we give the highest points for gender balance, not for more women. So it's really when there's gender balance that there's the highest points. Category C, we're looking for things under equal compensation and work-life balance, meaning does the company guarantee to pay living wages to everyone in their company? Do they publish their gender pay gap? Do they have a strategy to close their gender pay gap? What is their gender pay gap? Do they have parental leave policies for both men and women? How many weeks paid, not paid? Do they have flexible working hours and locations? And here again, it's for given points for whatever they have. If a company doesn't publish something, like for example, most companies in our database, about 80%, do not publish the gender pay gap. If they don't publish it, they get 0 points for that specific criteria, and this brings their total gender score down. We then look at a number of policies that promote gender equality. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I will tell you some of the ones that our investors are mostly interested in, and that is, does the company have an anti-sexual harassment policy? Does the company have a policy to supply from women-owned businesses? Does the company have a policy to secure the safety and well-being of women in the supply chain, and so forth? And finally, has the company committed to gender equality by signing the UN Women's Empowerment Principles or ever undergone a gender audit? All of this allows us to give a score to the company. Once we've collected this data and we score the company, we approach each one of the companies and we say, do you care to add anything else? A company can send us more information, but they must make it public for us to take care. So that's the data that we end up having in our database, the raw data, but also the scores. My clicker does not, yes, it's working again. I've already gone through the research process. So we capture the public data and then we contact the company and ask them if there's anything that they would like to add, and they can validate the data. So then we turn around and we go to the investors, large pension funds, asset managers, banks, family offices, and we say, we have this incredibly valuable data about how companies are doing on the issues of gender equality. And our clients use this data for ESG integration, here again, to strengthen the S of ESG, for portfolio analysis, for creating funds, for reporting back to clients, for index constructions, for shareholder engagement, controversy screening, anything like any other ESG data would be used. We have seen an incredible uptake in how many asset managers and asset owners are using our data. Probably the one that I'm most proud of the last couple months is that the largest asset owner in the world, the GPIF, the Japanese pension fund, has used Equileap's methodology and data for a second fund where they allocated $3.7 billion US. So with that high note, I end here, and I hope that this has given you sort of an idea of who we are, how we are collecting the data, and what we're doing with it. Stephen.
All right, thanks a lot, Deanna, for that presentation. It was very helpful and good to set the table and open things up. I certainly have a bunch of questions here for you today, but I want to also let our audience know you can join our conversation. You can pose some questions of your own using Slido, so slido.com, slido.com. And the hashtag we're using for this event is CCC Women in Business, and we will get to your questions shortly, but feel free to enter those questions as we go. So first, Dan, I wanted to take a step back in terms of the bigger motivation before we dig into some of the numbers and some of the results. What made you, or what motivated you to become the co-founder of Equileap?
Yeah, I love that question. In a past life, I was a women's rights activist, and I, I even minored in women's studies, went to work for NGOs for women's rights, for sexual and reproductive rights, economic empowerment of women. And I ended up finding another job as a philanthropy advisor at some point, and then I found myself working for a bank, advising wealthy individuals on how to give their money to NGOs. And that's when I realized that many of them were investing their endowments without using responsible ESG lens. So I looked into responsible investing and ESG and found out that we needed data in order to put screens for the environment, for climate. And that's when I came up with the idea of how about we would add a gender lens to our investments? Wouldn't that encourage companies to change quicker? And yeah, realized that there was no data. So this is why I quit my job and set up Equileap to set up the database and sell the data.
Wow, that's exciting. We're doing a business data lab here at Canadian Chamber, so
Yeah.
I can kind of can understand some of the challenges and some of the work, and I do agree that having data in any of these issues is obviously very important to help with overall advocacy and to help in investing decisions and those types of things. So a great
Mhm.
story and inspiring sort of setup for that. I want to talk about some of the leading companies. You have a very long list of rankings of companies that you go through. And there is a top 100 ranking. So let's just sort of take what are some of the characteristics of companies in your top 10 or your top 20? What are these companies doing right, and what lessons would you take from some of those companies for companies that are a little bit lower in the rankings?
Yeah, and you allude to our top 100 ranking. So I would like to let everyone know that on our website, www.equileap.com, under publications, anyone can download our global report, which we publish every year, and that's where the top 100 ranking is, Stephen. And indeed, if you look at the top 100 companies, I mean, the top 20 companies, what do they do right? They have the best gender balance at all levels of their company. So it's not just a good 30% of women on the boards, but it's really a good gender balance of between 40 and 60% at least three of the four different levels. They also are all companies that are publishing their gender pay gap, a very important thing. Some of them have good, uh, a gender pay gap that's not that bad. Others have not that good gender pay gap, but the fact that they're publishing it, they have strategies to try to close the pay gap. I also know that most of them have really good parental leave policies for both men and women. And so they're doing everything of what I showed you in our scorecard. They're doing most of them, most of the issues. I have to say that nobody's doing everything perfectly. The highest scoring company scores almost 80%. So we still see that there's a lot of room to improve.
Was looking through some of the differences by countries in terms of, and so you mentioned in your slides there, you're increasing the coverage and getting more into emerging markets. But I mean, in general, what we see, I think, is that the European countries are leading in this regard. And then looking down towards the bottom, let's say the US and Japan are doing a little bit worse than the other groups. When you first started collecting these data and the data sets, did any of these results surprise you? Did anything in this year's report, when you kind of go through and crunch the numbers, unexpected results, either for countries or those types of things?
Yes, I remember the first time we did this research and we published and we saw which countries are doing better. Um, and I was very surprised to see that the Nordic Scandinavian countries were not doing as well as I thought that they were going to be doing. And they haven't been doing great. The Netherlands, the country where we are located and where we do this work, doesn't do great either when you look at other European countries. A very clear lesson learned is that legislation works, and that the corporations listed in countries with legislation asking for transparency on gender equality issues, asking for targets, are the ones who are doing better. So indeed, who are the best performing corporates? It's the French. And we know that the French have had quotas for the board of directors for many years. They have now put new quotas for the executive C-suite. They have put in place excellent paternity leave and maternity leave. They're front runners in asking for different publication to the government, which then means that many corporates say, okay, I have to publish this to the government, so I might as well just make it public. Other countries that are doing really well are the Spanish and the Italian companies. And it's interesting to see that our perception is that there's more equality in the Nordic countries, but it's not the case. Another one that does really well are the Australian companies. And the reason is that in Australia, since 2012, the government put also in place legislation asking corporations to be more transparent and to talk about gender equality and to publish about it. And there you can see that just the mere fact that they had to publish, not so much the fact that they had to get to targets, but the fact that they had to publish encouraged companies or shamed companies into doing better.
Yeah, what I thought was interesting in the results is when you take even relatively similar countries, even within the European context. So you mentioned France as doing really well. France, the French approach focused a bit more on quotas and then looking at compliance. A little bit over, you've got Germany, and they're looking more at sort of aspirations and goals. Is it clear to you in terms of this dichotomy? Is there a right way to go? Do you think that culture is leading, or the legislation needs to bring the culture along? How do you see that sequencing?
Yeah, it's an interesting combination. And I think what has worked for the French is that on the one way, they're very typical French of putting the rules and this is what we're going to do and following it. At the same time, they do have a culture of equality and they're very proud about it. It's been very male-oriented equality, but if you talk to, Canada, of course, understands this with a very strong history and connection to the French culture. But there is also this proudness in l'égalité. And so that combined with the fact that after the Second World War, women stayed at the workforce, entered at the workforce much faster during the Second World War and stayed, which, for example, didn't happen in the United States. The United States women during the Second World War went to work, the middle class, let's say. But after the Second World War, were encouraged to go back home, while in France, they were encouraged to stay at work. And so the school system became longer, children getting warm meals during school. All of these things help to ensure that you have both parents working.
Can I bring things down to Canada for the time being? So we kind of started wide and then look global. In your report, when we look through the top 100 companies, there's 2 Canadian banks that reached in that top echelon. And even beyond the financial companies, there are certainly some communications companies in Canada that have scored pretty well in your rankings. However, I think in general, when we look through Canada as a whole, among this group, we are not doing that well. We're sort of towards the bottom. And it looks like you were not able to identify any individual company, major company, a publicly disclosed company, where they had closed the gender pay gap. And so the definitions that you're using in the report there, it's a mean salary between men and women, unadjusted, plus or minus 3%. And so it looks like you weren't able to find anything there. We have had some changes, though, at least on federally regulated companies in Canada. So last year, the government moved, and they're looking to require reporting of gender pay gaps for annual reports for those types of companies. But maybe you just talk a little bit about how is Canada doing in general, and what more do you think could be done when you compare to other countries, and are there any outlier areas you see that we could be moving on?
Yes, sure. So here again, the universe of the Canadian companies are the publicly listed companies with a market cap of $2 billion or more. So that means the mid and large cap publicly listed Canadian companies. Those are the ones we looked at. Of those companies, what we saw is the good news is you're doing better than your neighbors to the south of the United States when it comes to gender equality. The bad news is you're not doing as great as the European companies. And what we see in Canada is not that much gender balance at the leadership level, and also not that great gender balance at the mid-management level. So those are the two areas where we think there could be improvement, particularly because these are your largest companies. There's no or very little, I have to check, but almost no publication and transparency on the gender pay gap. We also found little evidence of companies that have a strategy to close the gender pay gap. If they do, they're not publishing it. But those are the areas. So trying to have a gender pay gap strategy and actually publishing it. And the parental leave in Canada that the companies, if the companies adhere to whatever the government says that you have to do, so they don't go better than that, but if you adhere to what the government is asking you to do, it's better than in the United States again, but it's not what we're trying to see. So many Canadian companies are not adhering to the ILOs, what they're asking and what we would like to see, which is at least 12 weeks paid maternity leave at 75% or more, and at least 2 weeks paid paternity leave. And so most of them are not reaching those levels.
Do you see differences between the public and private sectors? As I mentioned at least federally regulated and movements in Canada. Do you see differences if you compare across? I mean, I know a lot of this is private sector data, but do you see differences in terms of the way governments are moving and the way private sector moves in general?
So we are only researching what we call publicly listed companies. So those are the companies that are listed on your stock exchange. So I cannot compare a government company because we didn't. If it's not listed in the stock exchange, then we haven't researched it.
Okay. Can we talk about industries a little bit? Because there's another dimension to the data set is also the industry, the sector. There's pretty significant variations when you look across industries. So you've noted in the most recent 2023 report, financial sector has done better recently. There's been some clear market progress in the last year or so. The tech sector, I think, has probably been perennially lagging behind. Is there anything specific happening in these two sectors or other sectors? Anything you want to mention about implications or again best practices that some sectors are doing well and maybe others could be mirroring?
Yeah, the financial sector is doing quite well compared to the other sectors. It's doing better than the other sectors, and I think what happened here is that quite a while back there was a very clear accusation of this being a very male-oriented sector, and so the financial sector has been trying to change, and we see that they have been making changes, and they end up having a better gender balance at management and senior levels than the tech sector. So the tech sector is falling behind as far as gender balance is concerned. That's for sure. Because so many financial industry companies are in the UK, and the UK is forcing gender pay gap transparency, they have benefited from that because they're now publishing their gender pay gap. So I think that that's also one way that they have been able to do that. The tech sector tends to be focused mostly in the United States. And since there's very poor maternity leave, a non-existent paternity leave, they end up doing poorer for those reasons, up next to the fact that there's not enough women at the leadership and middle management level.
All right, so let's talk about gender lens investing, as you call it. So in recent years, we've seen a big rise in ESG in general, and certainly in the investing community. Financial values, ethical values are coming together in ways we haven't seen until more recently. Maybe first off, you can just explain a little bit more about what you mean by gender lens investing, how that works, how widespread do you see this movement being, and are you seeing momentum building among investors for this type of data that you're providing, but just in general, investing with more concern about gender equity?
Yes, gender lens investing is a very exciting movement. It cuts across all kinds of investment classes. And it can be one of four things. So it can be that you are at the lower level, you are investing directly in women-owned companies. And so you are supporting women-owned companies, women entrepreneurs, and that's one way to add a lens to your investments. The other way is that you could be investing in products and services that are good for women. So, for example, microcredit, which is used 80% by women, many times poor women, indigenous women, and these access to these small credits so that they can have their create their products. Then the other one is that you could be investing in companies which have better workforce balance and equality within the workforce and its supply chain. That's where we are. That's where I'm going to focus on and say that's exactly where we are working on, and that can be divided into two sections: the private markets or the public markets. So we focus on that one, public markets. And when I was looking into this, I realized that the only way we could select these publicly listed companies with a gender lens was by looking at which companies had women in the board of directors. And that to me was not enough. So that's when I said, I want to focus and help grow the gender lens investing movement. But what I'm going to do is then bring the data of not only are there companies with women in the boards, but add all these other criteria that I mentioned in the scorecard. So we play in this field of gender lens investing in the public markets, choosing the companies with best gender balance and policies all the way down to their supply chain. We have seen an enormous growth in the AUM going in this way. It's almost, has surpassed about, if I count all the funds that have been created with either our data or someone else's data, including public markets, we are at around 10 billion US dollars. It's still small if you think about the financial markets, but given how young the gender lens investing movement is, we're really proud to have reached that level.
Well, 10 billion sounds like a lot to me. So do you see, have you looked into the relationships or between some of the scores you have for gender equality by company? Do you see any relationships between the financial performance of those companies and the rankings? Anything positive there? Anything happening there?
Yeah, I am super proud about this because when we created the gender equality scorecard of Equileap, we were really thinking about social impact, purely social impact. So what's the what kind of change do we want to see within the companies? Gender balance, better policies, no sexual harassment, good supply chain management. Now, we thought of this way. And we created gender equality scorecard and we started scoring the companies thinking this is what we want, social impact. But since then, our gender equality scores have been used to build indices. Morningstar, Solactive, Euronext, Index, all these companies have used our scores to create gender equality indices, which are then being tracked by investment funds. And the fascinating thing, which is not surprising to us, but makes us very happy, is that the majority of the indices that have been built with Equileap's methodology are outperforming their benchmarks. So to give you two examples, Morningstar has built 9 indices with Equileap's methodology for Europe, for specific countries, for Canada, I believe also for the US, and 8 out of the 9 indices built by Morningstar with our methodology are outperforming their benchmarks. Another index that we launched in February of this year by Euronext, it took the French market, the 120 largest publicly listed companies in France, the SBF 120, and chose the 40 companies with the highest gender equality score, built the index, back tested it, and saw that every year there was an outperformance of 3% of the Equileap index against the SBF 120 index. So here again, we see that gender equality is not only nice to have and good to have, but it's great financial performance.
Okay, that's interesting. Let me, I'm just looking at the clock now and noticing that we're fast approaching our time. So I'll remind people to go back to Slido and input their questions. So I'm going to come to those quickly. I wanted to talk about flexible work arrangements just for a little
Mhm.
bit and touch on that. So the Business Data Lab at the Canadian Chamber, we've been looking at the return to the office across Canadian cities. And not surprisingly, you're not seeing a fast return in some of the big downtown cores in some big cities. So a lot of people engaging and embracing the flexible work, remote work, hybrid work. In the business surveys that we analyze, we see lots of companies that are offering more flexible work arrangements in the last couple of years. It's tight labor markets are trying to attract and retain talent. So, likely one of the silver linings of the pandemic could be that we'll have a lot more flexible work practices than prior to the pandemic. And that's going to
Mhm.
encourage labor force participation, particularly among women and women with small children. Just wondering in general, are you seeing those same sorts of trends beyond Canada across the world? And how permanent do you think these changes will be? And how do you measure those in your indices in terms of when flexible work is offered?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We're seeing that trend too. One of the fastest growing indicators, best improving indicators within our scorecard is flexible work. Um, we only give credit to a company when they say that they have installed flexible working hours and locations permanently. If they say we've done it as a post-COVID, but we will go back, then we don't give them points for that. Um, it's one of the most important things that you need to have in order to keep younger women uh, active in the workplace. It's one of the main reasons why women don't come back to work after they've had children, and one of the main reasons why they leave. I think it's a good norm to have this. I think the next step is to make sure that people who are flexible working can also be promoted, because sometimes that's the problem, that people who stay working flexibly do not get promoted. But it's really, really important to have flexible work. And I don't think it's only women who are asking for this. I think the younger generation of men are asking for it too. And they want flexible working locations, hours. They want more time with their children. And that's also good for the children themselves to have access to their fathers and to their mothers. So I hope that we continue to see this, and I hope that it continues to grow.
So let me try to get a little bit of advice out of you before we close up. And I'm still looking, there's still some more questions coming in, but we certainly have some companies in our audience today that would like to themselves do what they can to advance gender equality. But in
Mhm.
some cases, it's not obvious, where there's a lot of things to do, you a lot of different dimensions in your data set. Where could they start? What could they do, particularly for
Yeah.
SMEs, for these smaller companies? What's the first step to get moving in the right direction to make some progress?
Okay. If you are a smaller company and you're not in our universe, then look at the last page of our global report. The gender equality scorecard is there with all the 19 criteria explaining what they are. And I would say look at those and try to put those as targets. Use those to discuss internally and see if you can actually put those there. It's very easy to put targets at every level of the company. You can say, look, we want to have at least 40% of either men or women at every level here. So that's one thing that you can do. If you are a publicly listed company, then you're probably in our universe. And then it's a matter of contacting us, and we can provide you with a benchmarking report, which is a report where we will say, this is how you are doing on all the 19 criteria. And you can choose 5 competitors, and we can show you how you are performing against 5 of your competitors on the gender equality criteria. But then again, this is just for those companies that are publicly listed with a market cap of $2 billion or more.
I was on mute there. Coming back. So thanks for the advice for that. Let me look at time. I'm gonna take one from the audience here quickly. In your perspective, how's Canada doing compared with other countries in terms of closing the gender pay gap? So I don't know if you have specifics on Canada, but have you seen how are we doing? Is there any improvements on the Canadian data relative to others on the pay gap side?
So the overall Canadian gender pay gap, including everybody who works in Canada, is not one that I'm familiar with. I can say that the average of the European gender pay gap is 15%.
Okay.
So depending on where you are, you can compare to Europe. But the gender pay gap of the publicly listed companies in Canada, the situation is not transparent at all. So we don't see enough we don't see enough Canadian companies, the publicly listed companies, coming out and saying, look, we know that we have a problem with the pay gap, but this is what it is, and we're going to track it every year and we're going to publish it. So that's what I would like to see. I would like, we know that the gender pay gap exists in every single one of the companies around the world. But it would be great if Canadian companies and other companies around the world would come out, if the CEOs would say, yes, there's a gender pay gap. This is what it is. I'm going to publish it every year. I have a strategy to close it, and we're going to get to less than 3%, which is what we hope to see.
So it sounds like one of the key themes in terms of your talk is pushing for transparency. I was working in the budget office many years ago, and we always had the idea that sunshine was the best disinfectant, and the ways that you can get to improvements and things. So when people know and when people can quantify differences, they can actually make progress and move on them. So
yes, you can only change what you can measure. So
yeah.
you have to start measuring it, even if it's very poor and low, and then you can have a strategy to change it.
Okay, so let me ask you kind of our closing question here. I know you mentioned before, even your earlier journey, you've been involved in the women's rights movement in general for a while now. Are you seeing progress from year to year to year when you're looking at your reports? Are things moving in the right direction? Do you feel that there's progress happening? And do you have reasons for optimism for our audience, or how are you feeling about the whole movement right now?
You know, I did create Equileap out of a deep frustration that things were not changing. And it was this idea of, okay, we've tried education, we've tried legislation, we've tried awareness raising, let's try money, right? Let's try investments. So it was with this idea of we have to try something else to get things to move quicker. I am positive because I do see a positive change every year. We've published our gender equality global report every year, and we've seen incremental changes, very slow but positive, including COVID years. So I was positive about that. Do I think things are changing fast enough? No. According to the World Economic Forum, things are not going to change for what was the last estimate they came up with. The gender equality gap was not going to close for another 170 years at this rate. So it saddens me that I won't be able to see it, but I do want to be part of the change. So I think that if everyone starts to put forward in particularly if investors start to invest this way much more, companies are going to change, because in the end, companies care a lot about what their investors care. And if they're going to be selecting the companies which are doing best on gender equality, then I think that companies will change. So I'm hoping to see a bigger wave of investors behind gender equality.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Deanna, for joining us today. I appreciate you kicking off the day. It's been a great talk. Lots of data, lots of discussion about how we can move the needle here. We couldn't have asked for a better way to start off our session. So coming up, we've got a discussion with our SVP of Cogeco, followed by the first panel of the day on high growth sectors in the corporate pipeline. So first, as I close out the session, let me just thank Deanna Van Maasdijk for joining us today. It was a great talk and very useful to kick us off. So thanks a lot, and continue all the great work that you're doing at Equileap.